There is something that needs to be understood about what driving in America actually meant in the 1960s. It was not simply a way of getting from one place to another. The road had become something larger than that. It had become the way Americans understood their own country, their own freedom, and their own lives. And to understand why, you have to go back to what the roads themselves looked like and what people were driving on them. In 1930, crossing the United States from coast to coast took the average motorist about 3 weeks. Roads were rough, routes were inconsistent, and the country felt enormous in a way that was more exhausting than exciting. By 1960, that same journey took 4 days. 4 days to cross an entire continent. That compression of distance into time tells you everything about what happened to America between those two moments. The country had not gotten smaller, the infrastructure had gotten better. And with better roads came a feeling that the whole country was finally genuinely open. The foundation of it all was the Federal Aid Highway Act, signed by President Eisenhower in 1956. Eisenhower had seen the German Autobahn system during the Second World War and understood what a connected network of high-speed roads could mean for a nation. What he signed into law became the interstate highway system, and through the entire decade of the 1960s it was being built, expanded, and paved across the American landscape. Fresh concrete, wide lanes, smooth surfaces, and green overhead signs telling you exactly how far the next city was. For a country that had spent decades navigating narrow two-lane roads through small towns, the interstate felt like the future arriving all at once. But something else was happening alongside the new interstates. The old roads were fading. Route 66, the legendary highway that had carried families west through the Depression and soldiers home after the war, was losing its signs to the new freeways. Businesses that had built themselves around the old road found themselves cut off from the traffic that had once kept them alive. The 1960s were the hinge decade. New America and old America were driving alongside each other, and you could see both from the same windshield. None of it would have meant as much without the cars, and the cars of the 1960s were something that has never quite been repeated since. They had personality, they had presence. They had a kind of mechanical confidence that modern vehicles, for all their sophistication, simply do not possess. The Ford Mustang arrived in April of 1964 and changed everything immediately. It was affordable, it was sporty, and it looked like nothing that had come before it. Ford invented an entirely new category of automobile with a single model. They called it the pony car, and the rest of the industry spent years trying to catch up. The Mustang did not just sell well, it became a cultural object, the kind of car that meant something beyond its horsepower and its price tag. That same year, Pontiac introduced the GTO. It is widely recognized as the first true muscle car. It came with a 6.4-liter V8 engine capable of up to 348 horsepower, and it could reach 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. Pontiac expected to sell 5,000 of them. They sold 32,000. The American appetite for power and performance turned out to be larger than anyone in Detroit had anticipated. Then there was the Chevrolet Impala, which was something different entirely. Long and low and available in everything from a sensible 6-cylinder to a thundering big block V8, the Impala was the car that belonged to everyone. Families drove it. Young couples drove it. It could be modest or it could be magnificent depending on what you ordered, and that versatility made it the defining family car of the decade. What all these cars shared was the experience of being inside them. There were no cup holders. There was no center console dividing the two front seats. Instead, a single bench seat ran straight across the front of the car, and another ran straight across the back. 6 people could ride in reasonable comfort. Windows cranked down by hand. Air conditioning was available but far from standard. On the dashboard there was a cigarette lighter, an ashtray, and a single AM radio dial. That was the interior of the most advanced consumer technology most Americans owned. And underneath all of it was the engine. The V8 produced a low, steady rumble that you did not just hear. You felt it in your chest, in your seat, in the palms of your hands on the wheel. It was a physical experience in a way that driving today simply is not. The car communicated with you constantly. You always knew it was alive. This was the machine. This was the road. Now let's talk about what happened when you actually drove it. Getting behind the wheel and actually driving America in the 1960s was an experience that no app, no algorithm, and no modern convenience can quite replicate. The road asked something of you. It asked for your attention, your patience, and your willingness to figure things out as you went. And in return, it gave you something that people who made those drives still talk about decades later. It gave you the feeling that you were genuinely out there in the country, moving through it on its own terms. Navigation meant paper. There was no voice telling you to turn right in 300 feet. There was no blue dot moving across a glowing screen. What you had was a road atlas, thick and spiral-bound, or a folded map that never quite folded back the way it came. Families would spread the map across the kitchen table the night before departure, tracing routes with a finger, marking stops, estimating distances. Dad would refold it badly and stuff it in the glove compartment. Someone in the passenger seat would be responsible for reading it, which led to the particular kind of tension that only a misread map on a hot afternoon can produce. But there was adventure in it too. Unexpected exits became interesting detours. A wrong turn led somewhere worth seeing. The route was a plan, not a sentence, and the road rewarded people who stayed curious. The first stop after leaving home was often the gas station, and the gas station in the 1960s was nothing like what it became. You did not pump your own fuel. You did not swipe a card at a machine and stand alone in a parking lot. You pulled in, and a man came out. He pumped the gas. He checked the oil without being asked. He cleaned the windshield with a cloth while the tank was filling. He might check the tire pressure if you asked, and sometimes if you did not. It was a service in the full meaning of the word, and the price made the whole thing feel almost impossible to believe in retrospect. Gas averaged around 25 cents per gallon nationally. Some stations in competitive markets went lower. A large sedan with a big tank might cost $3 to fill completely. An entire cross-country trip, thousands of miles of American highway, could be driven on less than $100 of gasoline. For families operating on modest budgets, this was the detail that made the road trip not just appealing, but genuinely accessible. The open road was not a luxury. It was something most working families could afford to drive. At the end of the day's driving came the motel, and the American motel of the 1960s was its own particular institution. Rates ran from $8 to $12 per night at most roadside stops. Even in major cities, the price was manageable, though a hotel in New York City might shock a traveler with a rate of $24. Along the highways, motels announced themselves with tall illuminated signs visible from a mile down the road. Names like Starlight and Sunset and Traveler's Rest rendered in neon script against the evening sky. But the motel was more than a place to sleep. It was a temporary community. The swimming pool in the courtyard was the social center of the operation. Families from different states would drift out after dinner and end up talking for hours. Kids splashed in the water while adults sat in aluminum chairs and exchanged road reports and restaurant recommendations. There was a particular ease to those poolside conversations that came from the shared condition of being travelers. All of you passing through, none of you with any obligation beyond enjoying the evening. The smell was chlorine and freshly cut grass and sometimes charcoal from a nearby grill, and it meant the day's driving was done and tomorrow was still far enough away to ignore. Food on the road had its own rhythm. The roadside diner was the cornerstone of it. Countertops with spinning stools, pie turning slowly under glass domes, coffee that was never remarkable but always hot. A diner meal cost almost nothing and tasted like the particular satisfaction of eating after a long day of motion. The neon signs out front did the advertising, and the parking lot full of license plates from different states told you whether the food was worth stopping for. Route 66 itself was the birthplace of something that would eventually reshape American eating habits entirely. Red's Giant Hamburg in Springfield, Missouri, introduced the first drive-through restaurant, where you ordered without leaving your car and the food came to you. The first McDonald's had opened in San Bernardino, California, and the model of fast, cheap, reliable food at roadside locations was spreading steadily along the nation's highways. And at the end of an evening, if the family was not too tired, there was the drive-in theater. You found a space, hung a small metal speaker on the driver's window, and watched a film under an open sky. The kids could fall asleep in the back seat without missing anything. The adults could talk through the quiet parts. It was public and private at the same time, communal and comfortable, and it was exactly the kind of experience that belonged to the car and to nowhere else. No road in America carried more meaning in the 1960s than Route 66. It had been there since 1926, running 2,400 miles from Chicago to Santa Monica, passing through 8 states and every kind of American landscape along the way. By the time the 1960s arrived, the road had already accumulated decades of mythology. It had carried the Dust Bowl migrants west. It had sent soldiers off to war and brought some of them home. It had been written about and sung about and driven by more Americans than any other highway in the country. And in the 1960s, it was still very much alive, still the emotional center of what it meant to drive America, even as the interstates were beginning to pull traffic away from its 2 lanes. The television series Route 66 ran from 1960 to 1964 and put the highway directly into American living rooms at the exact moment when Americans were most eager to be on it. The show followed 2 young men driving the road in a Corvette, moving from town to town, picking up work, meeting people, getting involved in the kind of situations that only the road seemed to produce. It was aspirational in the purest sense. The highway was not just the setting, it was the point. The road itself was the American dream, and the show said so plainly every single week for 4 years. Families watched it and felt the pull. Young men watched it and started making plans. What those plans put them on was one of the most visually dramatic stretches of geography in the entire country. Driving Route 66 meant passing through the Painted Desert in northeastern Arizona, where the landscape turned colors that did not seem real from a car window. Deep reds and purples and ochres spread across miles of open terrain. The Grand Canyon was close enough to justify a detour that nobody regretted. Meteor Crater in Arizona, nearly a mile wide and 600 feet deep, sat just off the highway and drew travelers who had never seen anything like it and would not forget it. The road delivered these things to ordinary people in ordinary cars without requiring any special equipment or particular expertise. You simply drove, and the country revealed itself. And alongside the genuine natural wonders grew an entire ecosystem of roadside Americana that was just as memorable in its own way. Teepee-shaped motels offered rooms inside concrete structures built to look like Native American dwellings, which was eccentric and impractical and enormously popular. Frozen custard stands appeared at regular intervals. Curio shops sold turquoise jewelry and painted pottery and souvenirs of dubious authenticity. Reptile farms advertised live rattlesnakes and Gila monsters to anyone curious enough to stop and pay the entrance fee. Merrimack Caverns near St. Louis plastered its advertisements across barns across the entire Midwest, billing itself as the hideout of Jesse James with a confidence that outpaced the historical evidence considerably. The Big Texan Steak Ranch in Amarillo offered a free 72-ounce steak dinner to any customer who could finish the entire meal in under 1 hour. The road was lined with spectacle, some of it genuine and some of it pure invention, and the travelers loved both kinds equally. Running underneath all of it, quite literally, was the music coming through the AM radio. The radio was your only companion across the long, empty stretches between towns, and what it played in the 1960s felt made for the road in a way that was almost too perfect to be coincidental. Chuck Berry had released No Particular Place to Go in 1964, a song literally about riding in a car with a girl and going nowhere specific, which was exactly what half the people listening to it were doing at that precise moment. Nat King Cole had recorded Route 66 years earlier, but a new generation of drivers was hearing it fresh. And the line about getting your kicks felt less like a lyric and more like a direct instruction from a man who had clearly driven the road himself. The Beach Boys built something even larger. Their music constructed an entire mythology around cars and speed, and the particular freedom of moving fast on an open highway with the windows down. Listening to them on a straight, flat stretch of American road with nothing visible ahead, but more road, was an experience that matched the music so precisely it almost felt staged. The songs and the landscape were designed for each other. By the end of the decade, the road had taken on a new dimension entirely. Woodstock in 1969 drew hundreds of thousands of people from across the country, and nearly all of them drove to get there. The road trip had expanded beyond the family vacation and beyond the solo adventure. It had become the way a generation moved toward its own defining moments. The highway carried all of it, the families, the young men with plans, the musicians, the wanderers, and it did not ask any of them to explain themselves. You got on the road and the road took you where you were going. There is a particular kind of memory that does not fade the way other memories do. It is not stored in the mind the same way a date or a name is stored. It lives somewhere more physical than that. In the hands, in the chest, in the specific sensation of warm air coming through a car window at highway speed while the radio plays something you have not heard in 40 years, and suddenly you are back there completely, in the seat, on the road, with the whole country spread out ahead of you. That is what driving America in the 1960s produced. Not just trips, not just destinations. A physical experience of freedom that the people who lived it have never entirely left behind. The scale of it was real in a way that is difficult to communicate to anyone who has never navigated by paper map across several states. America is an enormous country. Anyone who has looked at a map knows this intellectually. But driving it, watching the landscape change hour by hour through a windshield, feeling the miles accumulate in your body the way long days of motion do, made the size of the country into something you understood in your bones rather than your head. Leaving the flat Midwest and watching the land begin to rise toward the Rockies. Crossing the desert and feeling the air change through the open windows. Coming over a ridge in the late afternoon and seeing a valley spread out below in gold light. These were not postcard moments. They were the actual experience of moving through a continental nation in a machine that connected you to the road rather than insulating you from it. The family road trip was the ritual container for all of it. It had its own choreography, repeated in driveways across the country every summer with minor variations in the same essential structure. The car was loaded the evening before because Dad wanted to leave before sunrise and beat the heat. The suitcases went in the trunk. The cooler went in the back seat, which meant the kids had less room, which meant the argument about who was touching whom began before the car had left the neighborhood. The map was in the glove compartment, folded incorrectly, as it always was and always would be. Mom had packed sandwiches in wax paper and put them in the cooler next to the drinks. And there was a strict understanding that the sandwiches were for lunch and not to be touched before the state line. Dad checked the oil in the driveway in the early morning quiet. This was a ritual within the ritual. Hood up, dipstick wiped on a rag, checked again, hood closed. Then he walked around the car once, checking the tires the way men of that generation checked tires, pressing a thumb against the sidewall as though the information were being transmitted directly through the skin. Then everyone got in and the engine turned over and the trip began. Inside the car, there were no screens, no headphones routing each passenger into their own private world. No individual entertainment systems removing the need to negotiate, compromise, or simply sit with each other in the same moving space. There was the radio, which everyone heard, and the windows, which everyone felt, and the landscape, which everyone saw. The license plate game required looking out the window. The cow counting game required looking out the window. The questions about what state that was and how far to the next stop required looking out the window. The car was a shared room, and whatever was happening in it was happening to everyone simultaneously. Seatbelts were not federally required as standard equipment until 1968, and even after that they were more presence than practice for most families. There was no FM radio in most cars. Cassette tapes did not exist as a consumer product until the end of the decade. Air conditioning was available but far from universal. By every measurable standard of modern automotive comfort, the experience was primitive. And yet nobody who made those drives remembers feeling that anything was missing. The road provided its own completeness. What the 1960s gave American drivers was a specific and unrepeatable combination of circumstances. The infrastructure was new enough to feel like a gift. The gas was cheap enough that distance was not a financial calculation. The cars had enough personality to make the act of driving itself pleasurable rather than merely functional. And the country was open in a way that felt earned, not given. The result of a decade of construction and prosperity and the particular post-war confidence that believed problems could be solved and distances could be crossed and the horizon was always worth driving toward. That feeling did not survive the decade unchanged. The 1970s would bring the oil crisis and rising costs and the beginning of the traffic that would eventually make certain roads feel less like freedom and more like obligation. But in the 1960s, the equation was still simple. You got in the car, you pointed it toward something, and America opened up in front of you like it had been waiting all along. The 1960s road trip was a specific window in American life that has never quite reopened. The infrastructure was new, the gas was cheap, the cars had personality, and the country felt genuinely open in a way that people who drove it still remember in their hands and their chest and somewhere deeper than memory. For those who loaded the station wagon, spread the map across the hood, and pointed toward the horizon, it was never just a trip. It was America at its most itself. And for one golden decade, the road belonged to everyone. Please subscribe.